Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Ghired, Mirror of the Wilds. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but this price doesn't include costs such as shipping. So, Ghired, Mirror of the Wilds is a 3/3 legendary human shaman with haste, costing a red, a green, and a white mana to cast, and gives non-token creatures you control the ability to be tapped to create a token copy of a target token that you control and had entered the battlefield that turn, which gives this deck a pretty straightforward goal, with a general go wide with token strategy. We'll look to achieve this by having a decent chunk of the deck being dedicated to non-token creatures, with many of those producing tokens themselves, predominantly creature tokens, but with a smattering of treasure include tokens as well, which will serve to both make the initial tokens, but to also duplicate those tokens so long as you have Ghired on the field. And generally, you're going to look to use your non-token creatures each turn to duplicate tokens that you've made, while using your previously duplicated creature tokens to swing. But with that quick preamble out of the way, let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up for land-based ramp, we have Rampant Growth to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, along with Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, which tutor two basics which you reveal, with one going onto the battlefield tapped, and the other going into your hand. Then our only mana rock is Arcane Signet, which will tap for any color that we need, and then moving on to our mana dorks, which can also act as token generators with Ghired's ability, we have Avacyn's Pilgrim for producing white mana, Elvish Mystic, Fyndhorn Elves, and Llanowar Elves for producing green mana, and finally we have Gold, Iron, and Copper Mirror, which produce white, red, and green mana, respectively. But now let's move on to the many token generation spells that we have in this deck. Starting with our creature token generation, Amira Angel, Felidar Retreat, and Rampaging Balos make a 1/1 bird with flying, a 2/2 cat beast, and a 4/4 beast creature token whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, respectively. Then Dragon Master Outcast is an easy 1-drop that can work well later in the game, as it makes a 5/5 dragon creature token with flying at the start of your upkeep, provided you control 6 or more lands. Court of Grace makes you the monarch and brings about that whole mini game with it, but it also makes a creature token at the start of your upkeep. Either a 1/1 spirit with flying if you aren't the monarch, or a 4/4 angel with flying if you are. Gruff Triplets can be a fun one in this deck, as it's a 3/3 trampler that makes 2 token copies of itself when it enters the battlefield, and it isn't a token. And then when one of those Gruff Triplets dies, you put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to that triplet's power onto the remaining Gruff Triplets. And with Ghired, we'll be looking to have a lot more than just the 2 token copies. Then, when Eartha Joe, Frontier Mentor, enters the battlefield, it makes a 1/1 mercenary creature token that can be tapped to give a target creature you control +1 power for the turn at sorcery speed. But importantly, whenever you activate an ability targeting a creature or player, you copy that ability and can choose new targets for that copy, which would apply if we're using the Ghired ability to make a copy of a target creature token. And then Ghired, Conclave Exile, makes a 4/4 Rhino creature token upon entering the battlefield, and then whenever Ghired Conclave Exile attacks, you populate, making a copy of a creature token that you control, with that token entering the battlefield tapped and attacking. Then Amara, Soul of the Accord, makes a 1/1 soldier creature token with lifelink whenever it's tapped. Giant Adaphage is a 7/7 trampler that makes a token copy of itself whenever it deals combat damage to a player, which could get out of hand if you start duplicating those tokens. And then Galta and Mavrin is a 12/12 that, whenever you attack, you either make an XX dinosaur creature token with trample, with X being the greatest power among other attacking creatures, or make X 1/1 vampires with lifelink, with X being the number of other attacking creatures. Then Andril, Flame of the West, is an equipment that makes 2 1/1 spirit creature tokens with flying whenever its equipped creature attacks, with those tokens being tapped and attacking if the equipped creature was legendary. And then Advent of the Worm simply makes a 5/5 worm with trample. Then we have a handful of spells that can make token copies of our creatures, including Flame Shadow Conjuring, letting you make a token copy with haste of a non-token creature that enters the battlefield under your control if you pay a red mana, but you exile that token at the beginning of the next end step. But with Ghired's ability, we can make copies that don't get exiled. Felden of the Third Path does similar, making a hasty copy of a creature or artifact in your graveyard that we could copy with Ghired. Ortheon, Hero of Lavabrink, makes a hasty token copy of a creature you control that also gets exiled at the start of your next step, though this is at sorcery speed. Then Jaxus the Troublemaker does very similar to Ortheon, but also acts to cycle out a card as Jaxus has you discard to make a hasty token copy of a creature you control with the ability, when this creature dies, draw a card, with you sacrificing that token copy at the beginning of your next end step. Then finally, for this type of effect, Blade of Selves gives its equipped creature Myriad. where, when it attacks, for each opponent other than the defending player, you make a token copy of that creature that's tapped and attacking that player or planeswalker they control, which get exiled at the end of combat. However, there should be a brief window while blockers are being declared, where you still control those attacking token copies, and can tap your remaining non-token creatures to make copies that won't be exiled at the end of combat. Then moving on to non-creature token generation, Rosy Cotton of South Lane makes a food token upon entering the battlefield, but additionally, whenever you make a token, you put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control that isn't Rosy. Tireless Provisioner makes a food or treasure token whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Gallagher's trigger whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, and having you choose one of 3 abilities that wasn't already chosen that turn, with one of those being make a treasure token. Tireless Tracker makes a clue token whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, and Bygone Bishop makes a clue token whenever you cast a creature spell with mana 3 or less. Sophina, Spear Sage Deserter, makes a clue token whenever she attacks for each non-token attacking creature. And then Roxanne, Starfall Savant, makes a tapped artifact token called Meteorite whenever Roxanne enters the battlefield or attacks, where Meteorite deals 2 damage to any target upon entering the battlefield and can be tapped to produce 1 mana of any color, while Roxanne also makes tapping artifact tokens for mana more effective. Then finally for this section, Growing Ranks is an enchantment that has you populate at the beginning of your upkeep, but now I'd like to go over a handful of spells that we can use to buff a wide portion of our board. Roar of Resistance will give our creature tokens haste, letting us swing with them a turn earlier, while also giving us the option to pay a bit of mana to give our attacking creatures +2 power for the turn. And for more haste, we have Rising of the Day and Tuk Tuk Rebel Fort, which gives all of our creatures haste, with the former giving our legendary creatures +1 power, with the latter being a wall, which we could use for blocking or making more copies of tokens. Then, since we're planning on having a decently wide board of creature tokens, we have a couple of anthems for them with Intangible Virtue and Prava of the Steel Legion, the former giving our creature tokens +1/+1 in Vigilance, and the latter giving them +1/+4 during our turn and acting as a source of creature token generation. And before I move on, Village Bellringer isn't really an anthem or a buff, but can still be useful in this deck, and I didn't have a good chapter to put it in. But anyway, the Bellringer is a 1/4 with flash that has us untap all creatures we control when it enters the battlefield, which could be used offensively, or it could be used to double up on our Ghired token generation. But now let's move on to our draw spells to keep us from top decking. First up are a few simple sorceries, with Harmonize having us simply draw 3, Shamanic Revelation having us draw 1 card for each creature we control, and Audience of Trostani having us make a 0/1 plant creature token, and then having us draw cards equal to the number of differently named creature tokens that we control. Then for some draw across turns, I'll start with Welcoming Vampire and Rumor Gatherer, the former having you draw 1 whenever 1 or more other creatures with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, though this only happens once per turn, and the latter having you scry whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control. But the second time that this triggers in a turn, you draw instead, and any following trigger would have you scry still, so it helps with cleaning the top of your deck. Then Idol of Oblivion can simply be tapped to draw a card, provided you made a token that turn, which should be a pretty low bar for this deck. And Staff of the Storyteller makes a 1/1 spirit creature token with flying when it enters the battlefield, and it gains a story counter whenever you create 1 or more creature tokens, which, by tapping the staff with 1 white mana and removing a story counter, you draw a card. Then Lynor, Autumn Sovereign, has you put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control at the beginning of combat on your turn, and then has you draw a card if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers. Wily Duke, Add-in Hero, has you gain a life and draw a card whenever it's tapped, which works nicely since you'd likely be drawing while also making a copy of a token. And finally, while not directly draw, Nayali, Sun's Vanguard, gives your attacking tokens double strike and has you exile a card from the top of your library whenever 1 or more tokens you control attacks the player, which you can play that card any turn that you've attacked with a token. But now let's move on to the spells that we can use to interact with what our opponents are doing. First up for some single target removal are Swords to Plowshares and Path to exile a target creature. Then Generous Gift is a fun one in this deck, since you can use it as general target permanent removal, but in a pinch, you could target one of your own cheap permanents to make a 3/3 elephant creature token that you could then copy with Ghired's ability. Then Sundering Growth lets us destroy a target artifact or enchantment and then populate to make another creature token copy. Then we have a selection of spells that can change the targets of a target spell or copy a target spell, such as Shunt, changing the target of a target spell, Dualcaster Mage and Reverberate, which let you copy a target instant or sorcery spell and choose new targets for the copy, and Return the Favor, which lets you do either or both of the discussed effects. These can lead to some pretty interesting uses, But the important one to note is that any of these can be used to counter a counterspell. For Shunt, you can change the counterspell's target to Shunt itself instead of the original target. And then for Reverberate type effects, you can just copy the counterspell and counter the counterspell with it. Now finally for interaction, we'll want at least a couple of board wipes, so here we have Hour of Reckoning and Azuri's Predation. Hour of Reckoning destroys all non-token creatures and has Convoke to help lower its cost. And Azuri's Predation makes a 4/4 beast creature token for each creature your opponents control, and then has each of those beasts fight a different creature. So you're likely to wipe a lot of lower toughness creatures, and are also likely to keep some of those beast creature tokens around, which you can then copy through Ghired's ability. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's take a look at that land base. First up are a couple of land tutor lands, with Promising Vein tutoring a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and Myriad Landscape tutoring 2 basic lands of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Then we have Temple of Triumph, Abandon, and Plenty, Scry dual tap lands for the 3 color pairs of the deck. Then we also have Clifftop Retreat, Rootbound Crag, and Sunpetal Grove, which enter the battlefield untapped if you control a mountain or a plains, a mountain or a forest or a plains, respectively. Then Sunscorched Divide, Mossfire Valley, and Sungrass Prairie convert 1 generic mana into a red and a white, red and a green, or a green and a white mana, respectively. We also have Canopy Vista and Cinderglade, being Selesnya and Gruul slow lands. Exotic Orchard is likely to tap for at least one of the colors we need, as it taps for mana of any color an opponent's land could produce. And then Jungle Shrine, Path of Ancestry, and Command Tower will tap for any color mana we could possibly need. And for a bit of utility, Mirror Pool can produce generic mana, but could also be sacked to create a token copy of a target creature that you control, which of course you could then duplicate. But aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 6 plains, 6 mountains, and 6 forests. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing around $44.50 at the time of recording, which includes our basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but this price doesn't include costs such as shipping. And before I close out this video, I'd like to quickly go over a handful of cards that you may wish to consider when upgrading or refining this deck to your taste. Firstly, Midnight Guard and Sunstrike Legionnaire kinda break this deck since they can very easily make an infinite number of creature tokens if Ghired is out, they don't have Summoning Sickness, and you made a creature token that turn, as they'd untap whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control. So you tap them to make a copy of a creature token, and then that creature token untaps them, and you repeat. They aren't exactly expensive cards, they just felt like combos that were a little bit too easy to achieve, so I left them for you to decide if you want them in the deck or not. Nesting Dovehawk is a flyer that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature token enters the battlefield under your control, and has you populate at the beginning of combat on your turn. Helm of the Host is an equipment that has you make a token copy of its equipped creature with haste, but if the equipped creature was legendary, the token won't be legendary, letting us skirt around the legend rule, and of course we can then make copies of that token with Ghired's ability. Kiki Jiki, Mirror Breaker, Twin Flame, and Molten Duplication are all ways that we can make token copies of non-legendary creatures that we remove at the start of our next end step, but of course we can make copies of those that won't be removed. Then Risk the Redeemed works best when we already have a field of creature tokens, as its second ability has you make a token copy of each creature token we control, but for less mana, Risk can also be tapped to make a 1/1 Elf Warrior creature token. Tribute to the World Tree is likely to buff our board of creature tokens hard, as most of them will have less than 3 power, so they would enter the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on them, but this spell can also provide a decent amount of card draw. Virtue of Loyalty is an adventure enchantment with an instant that makes a 2/2 knight creature token with vigilance, but the main enchantment buffs each creature we control with a +1/+1 counter and untaps them at the beginning of our end step. And you may wish to consider Mines of Moria, as it's a land that can produce treasure tokens that you could duplicate. But regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, maybe consider dropping it a like, and sub if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. But regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.